Hello, welcome to Jewish Culture and Jewish Awareness. My name is Dustin Hausner. I'm the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. All our funds are from the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. My apologies, I am a little nervous. So the reason I'm nervous is while I've done quite a number of these interviews, sometimes I'm very lucky to get people on my wish list that I'm able to get on the show and talk about their wonderful work. I'm really excited for today's guest. I think they've done a lot of great writing, especially their latest book, which I look forward to diving in and talking about. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce to me the wonderful Professor Marc Dollinger, Professor of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University, who's written a number of books, including The Jews and Liberalism in Modern America, Quest for Inclusion, California Jews, American Jewish History, a Primary Source, where you're a contributor and editor in that, and of course your latest book, Black Power, excuse me, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. It is such an honor to have you with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here, and I look forward to the day that we can get on airplanes again and I can be in northern New Jersey personally.
It would be a great pleasure and would love to see you do a live lecture and speaking about your work. So before we dive into the book, I want to give an opportunity for those who aren't familiar with your work. If you could talk a little bit about yourself, your work and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trained as an American Jewish historian. I teach in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. My interest has been Jews and politics, the two things you're never supposed to talk about in polite conversation, right? Religion and politics. So this is what I dive right into the heart of. I was first interested in Jewish liberalism in 20th century America. And I've sort of expanded, I'm here in California, so I've done work particularly on California Jews. And now I'm really interested in questions of Jews, race, and racism, especially in the current national reckoning on race.
So let me ask you, because again, you've written quite a bit about the American Judaism, Jewish identity, the history of it. Is there something particular that made you fascinated in this subject matter where you've obviously written so much and dedicated so much of your work about, or did you kind of wake up one day, decide not to be a rabbi and decide to go into this instead?
Yeah, exactly, literally, right? Growing up, I've always been interested in the line between being an American and being a Jew.
Mm.
Like I remember in religious school growing up, we get the question, are you a Jewish American or an American Jew? Which identity is first? And when I got to graduate school, and I'll be honest and humble here, my classmates were so smart and were working on dissertation topics so sophisticated, I knew I could never compete in whatever they were doing. And I thought to myself, well, what am I just interested in deeply where I could be competitive in an academic market? And for me, it was this line between Jewishness and Americanness. So I've tried to sort of apply it and spin it in different ways.
Interesting. So obviously your book, your most recent book, which I say recent, came out in 2018, pre 2020 and the very crazy year that was 2019. But what's interesting about this book is, well, there's a lot of things interesting about the book, but and you mention it in the very beginning of it, you talk about kind of the things you're taught early on when you're Jewish, obviously the terrors of the Holocaust, support for Israel, and this idea of the Jewish Black Alliance, and this rich history of Jews and their involvement in your book. um, in a in a way, I think expands on that narrative in a way that's very fascinating to me. And you actually have a very personal story that connected you to this book. I was wondering if you would feel comfortable telling it.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I just want everybody who's viewing this and everyone in your community to know, thank you for reading the book. Believe it or not, most people who interview me on the book have not read it. So I want to really appreciate that, and I honor you for taking that time in order to do that. Yeah, I tell a bunch of stories. I'll give you one of my favorites. If there's another you want me to tell, just jump in. When I did my undergraduate work at University of California, Berkeley, and as a good sort of, white Jewish liberal, I was raised in the suburbs of LA. I learned about Dr. King and Jews in the civil rights movement. And I was all ready, to do my part. So my first week of college, I went to the Hillel table and got all the information to be in the Jewish group. And then I went to the Black Student Union table to introduce myself and see if we might start a Black Jewish dialogue. And my African-American classmate on the other side of the table just burst out laughing at me.
Um,
And I was, shocked, surprised, horrified, embarrassed, right? And
Sure.
I think he read my face pretty quickly and understood. And he was nice about it, but he said, "Look, he said, I'm from Harlem."
Mm,
And like literally I knew what that meant. Like I knew Harlem, right? But I really understood that he was communicating something deeper to me, which is, you're a white middle class kid from LA, and I'm a Black man from Harlem. And guess what? Our life experiences and our perspectives are so fundamentally different
mm.
that for you to walk up to me and say, "Let's get along," there's actually more to it. And at the end of the conversation, he said, "Look, I don't think there's going to be interest in that, but if you're in, I'm happy to pitch it for you, right?" And I said, "It's okay, we're good." And in essence, even though I didn't know it at the time, that was the first day of my research on this book, which is to try to unwind and unpack how what that conversation meant.
But I think it's so like I hear that story and I read the story obviously and it just resonated because I feel like there's so many people I know who had a similar experience where they were told, we have this great alliance, we have this rich history, and then you meet people from other communities and it's they almost think you have three heads. Like what do you expect, a hug and a kiss and solidarity? And you go into really I would say pre-World War II, going all the way up to about the late 70s on kind of the evolution of not just the Black Power movement, but also Jewish identity. Before we go any further, before we get into the history, one thing you mentioned that I think is really important is your background is Jewish studies in regards to talking about Black Power versus the Jewish politics of it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you did the balance between talking about those two different communities.
Such a good question, especially in the identity politics of today. And I have to be perfectly clear. First of all, I'm trained in US history. My PhD is in 20th century US history. That's where the sort of the Americanness frame comes in. So I'm looking at the Jewish experience in the United States from the perspective of US history.
Mm,
Um, Academic historians have something called historiography. It's the graphing of history. It's the history of historical writing, which is a fancy way of saying every 20 years, a new generation of scholars look at the same historical event
mm,
through a new lens, right? And I'm in American Jewish history. My interest is American Jews. There is a literature on the history of American Jews and politics and Blacks and Jews, like all the different things I'm talking about. There have been books and articles and journalistic articles written over the years. So my job is to read all of those,
mhm.
analyze them, and see if I can come up with a new, better, deeper version. It just so happens that my version runs through Black Power.
Mm.
That said, I'm not trained in African American history. And if I were trained in African American history, I would have been reading all the books in African American history and all their debates. And I would want to know how the Black Power and the Jews responds to questions that Black studies scholars are asking. So I have to be clear, especially when I give public lectures, that's not what I'm there for. I'm here to talk about how Black Power reflects on white Jews in the history of white American Jews. So sometimes the title can be confusing for folks who are expecting a 50-50 talk, right? Between white Jews and Blacks, when in fact, I'm pretty much talking about white Jews.
So let's start in the beginning of the book because obviously we'll get into the 60s and the 70s and so forth. And obviously, I think it says the 60s on it. We'll talk a decent amount of the 60s. But what was from your beginning of it, the relationship between the Jews and the Black African American communities and also where obviously wherever you feel comfortable talking about the origin setting.
Yeah. So first we'll talk about historiography. We'll talk about how different generations of historians have looked at it. Our conversation is less about the history and more about the historical literature, so first of all, American Jews have been disproportionately engaged in liberal and progressive politics for over 100 years. In fact, American Jews are the second most liberal voting bloc in American politics. Only the Black community is more liberal or progressive than the Jews. So in the civil rights movement, when you look at the white civil rights workers who came south to register voters, to march with Dr. King, they were disproportionately Jewish. And in many cases, a majority of the whites were Jews. So this created in the historiography, right, in the literature, in the tellings, this sense of Jewishness being connected with social justice and anti-racism work. And that was the first group of books that came out. Except,
Please,
if you look at it in a deeper way, there's more to the story. For example, we don't talk a lot about Southern Jews in the 50s and 60s.
Sure.
And one reason we don't, meaning academic historians and journalists don't, is because they really, as a group, did not support at least a public sort of civil rights movement. Many argued that they were working with quiet voices, as one of the books about it says, or behind the scenes. But if you're a Southern Jew and you're in business, because so many were, if you joined the civil rights movement, whites would boycott you. And if you didn't, Blacks would boycott you. As some of the rabbis in the South said, they couldn't win for losing. Meanwhile, these young Northern Jews come down, they stay for a week or two, they make trouble, right? Good trouble, we would hope, with John Lewis. And then they go home, and the Southern Jews are left to bear the brunt of the anger and the hostility that Jews were involved. So there's a big piece of the story, which is, how do Northern and Southern Jews interact? The second, and this is what I covered in my first book,
please.
The Northern suburbs were racially segregated. At the same time that American Jews achieved the dream of homeownership, at the same time anti-Semitism dropped so that those restrictive housing covenants that wouldn't allow Jews or Blacks now allowed Jews. The moment a Jewish family was able to do what their immigrant ancestors dreamed of, right, get a house in the suburbs, they were actually part of a racist system of housing, because Blacks were still omitted on that housing covenant. And even after the Supreme Court made that illegal, there still were and are informal ways that basically all white neighborhoods stay all white. So as soon as one begins to weave in lots of different American Jewish stories, then we see that there's a whole lot more dynamic. And if I could give one more example, because you talked about sort of the earlier period, chapter 1 of the Black Power book is research on the Nation of Islam. I found this stunning. The Nation of Islam today is Louis Farrakhan.
Right.
They are an anti-Semitic organization. Before that, it was Malcolm X. Before that, it was Elijah Muhammad. And one would expect that when you have, in this case, Elijah Muhammad in 1959, made a speech where he called Jews Christ killers, which is a classic anti-Semitic trope. But the American Jewish Committee and the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, did not call them anti-Semitic.
Wow.
In fact, they encouraged, the ADL encouraged their regional offices to downplay the anti-Semitism of the Nation of Islam. I found it stunning, because today, of course, Louis Farrakhan is big on the American Jewish radar. And for me, I needed to figure out how and why it could be that the Nation of Islam remained as anti-Semitic as it always was, but Jewish organizations led by middle-aged white Jewish men had very different approaches to it.
Well, to your point, though, also with, just thinking of history, how it can get rearranged and, rewritten depending on how time goes by and people's interpretations, like hearing like something like an ADL defending that organization to a modern audience is just mind-boggling. And I was going to bring this up later, but I'll briefly mention it now. I know when you do lectures, you do a fun activity with the people who attend your program with quotes. And what's interesting is they get them wrong, it seems, all the time, which is kind of the point. But the statements you find from different Jewish organizations and leaders that said what they said at the time that for us goes so against what the narrative would be that we would consider is just deeply fascinating, to say the very least.
Yeah, thank you for the insight on the pedagogy. And just to bring people up to speed, when I do the book talk on Zoom on the Black Power book, and if anyone's going to attend one of these, you have to follow Professor Dollinger's honor code now, right? You can't use private chat to tell someone the answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I did is I pulled historical quotes that I found in the archives, but I took away the name of the person who said it, and I took away the year. And then I asked people to guess in the chat who said it and when. And of course, as you implied, it's designed for them to think, Malcolm X must have said this, or Stokely Carmichael, the leader of Black Power. And it turns out to be like a rabbi, or the American Jewish Committee. And as soon as I do the big reveal to show that it was a Jewish person and not a Black militant, I watch the faces of the people on Zoom, and they're surprised. And I said, that surprise is historiography. That's because I was too raised with one version. And now when you go back into the archives and find out that something else was actually going on, this is where academic books come in. This is the job of academic books.
So I don't want to reveal any quotes because I want people to go out and obviously read the book, and I don't want to spoil for anyone who has the pleasure of joining either your book club or anything else and has a chance to do this firsthand. But something that amazed me was the Jewish leadership. Some of the ones that you quote, that some of them saw things like Black Power coming decades before anyone else did, and they supported these movements, but they had such foresight that the narrative we're always told, and like I said, you mentioned in the book, is this idea that American Jews were shocked when the divergence happened, and your book says no, there were people who knew that this would probably happen.
Thank you. This is about the historian's word causality. Causality is what caused history to happen the way it did. And growing up, I understood that the Black Jewish Alliance was a great thing, Heschel and King, arm in arm, interracial, interfaith, and then
Mhm.
the rise of Black Power, the rise of Black militancy and nationalism, anti-Semitism among some in the Black community, the purging of Jews from leadership positions, like all of this coalesced in the mid-1960s and ruined a perfectly good thing, right? So now the Jews play the role of the helpers, and the Black Power activists are now playing the role as the destroyers of an interracial alliance. Then I started reading public essays. I found one from 1960. And here we have a leader from the ADL who is announcing to everyone, guess what? Black folk are getting empowered as it needs to be. Black leadership is becoming more and more frustrated with white liberals and the limits and what we now call the fragility of white liberals. And there is going to be a time coming soon when there will be a demand for Black autonomy. And there was going to be an increase in anti-Semitism. Everybody in the Jewish community, get ready for it. All right, so that was 1960. If at the kumbaya moment when all of us thought everything was going great, we have national leaders publishing for everybody to read, heads up, this is coming down the road, then guess what? When Black Power comes in 64, 65, it's not actually the reason of the split. It reflects what even Jewish leaders in the King era knew and understood and predicted. And I don't want to give it away, but I actually found quotes that go even earlier than 1960 that showed that Jewish civil rights activists understood as much good as they can do, that there are always going to be limits to allyship.
No, and again, I don't want to spoil it at all, but some of the quotes you find are just simply astounding, to say the very least, of some of, and the positions of the leaders. I'll just say that much. But going to Black Power for a moment, did leadership and did people find that, that there was something, that there was a natural progression to that, and also, was there something that Jews could find from such a movement?
Yeah, so excellent question. The civil rights movement was rooted in bringing legal change,
Hmm.
right? Because of Jim Crow, you needed to fight Jim Crow. And the way you fight Jim Crow is, first in 1964, you get Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act. And in 1965, you pass the Voting Rights Act. As difficult and as many people who even died to achieve those two legislative victories,
Mhm.
the truth was, promising legal equality does not bring real equality. And this was a moment of convergence, or divergence actually, um, where a new generation of young Black activists were ready to say, okay, now that we've got it in the law, now we got to make it real.
Mhm.
And you had a lot of white Jewish liberals who are like, mission accomplished. We've got the bill we wanted. There's no more Jim Crow, and they go back to their suburban homes.
Mhm.
So that was one moment of the split. There's a lot of other elements that went into it, but what you were intimating, which is actually, so the book I wrote in reverse, because I didn't know this was a book that it was going to be. The first title of the book was going to be Turning Inward,
Hmm.
American Jews in the 1970s,
Interesting.
because I was, okay, a little self-reflection on my own life, because I was raised in the 70s, but I was interested in the Soviet Jewry movement
Hmm.
and why it got so big. I was interested in American Zionism after the 1967 Six-Day War. I was interested in the religious revival that had so many Jewish kids becoming more ritually observant than their parents. I was even interested in the right wing, the Jewish Defense League, Meir Kahane, and how strong he got
Mhm.
in this period. And while I was trying to locate the Jewish ethnic and religious revival of the 70s, I kept reading the words Black Power everywhere. In rabbinic sermons, they were saying Black Power. And then it dawned on me
Yeah.
that this was actually the book. That what happened was Black activists made it cool and fashionable to be ethnic.
Hmm.
For Jews in the raised in the 50s, who were pretty much trying to just get along with the white Christian majority around them and not being so public in their Jewishness, once the 60s hit,
Yeah.
and once Black activists literally took to the streets, and then when the alliance broke up in the mid 60s, right, and Jews are like, okay, well, we're not even going to be in for civil rights for Blacks now, but we're going to be in for Jewish power instead of Black power,
Hmm.
right? And we're going to, so they start fighting for Soviet Jewry. 1/3 of the Soviet Jewry activists were trained in the civil rights movement.
That's-
Um, and a lot of the tactics that Soviet Jewry activists used came right from the movement for racial equality.
hmm.
So what we had was a parallel or a mirroring of the old Black Jewish alliance with a new Jewish ethnic revival. And what I found so stunning is national Jewish leaders and rabbis appreciating Black power for the gift.
Hmm.
So at the same moment, some in the Jewish community criticized anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as it was coming out from these circles, were also recognizing that this was a gift. And this was a way that Jewish leaders could mobilize Jews to be more identified as Jews.
So it kind of comes from, just from a place thinking about it, it's the convergence of the two communities, really the civil rights movement, but then as even Black Power and the way that we're speaking about it is going, and even the negative parts of it, obviously the anti-Semitism that you mentioned, then suddenly the Jews are almost replicating what they're doing in a sense of almost like a give and take type process. So they're not the alliance, but they're almost in the same trajectory in a manner of speaking.
Exactly. So I argue, and the title of the book is a reinvention of the 1960s, because first it was invented because we made up all these stories, and I'm going to reinvent it to say there was an alliance after the mid 60s It was not an alliance where blacks and Jews and white Jews were marching side by side, arm in arm, but they were following the same page in the strategy handbook of Black Power activism, which is Black Power is going to advocate for blacks, Jews are going to advocate for Jews. The new wave feminist movement came, second wave in the 1970s. Mecha, the Latinx activist movement came. There were so many different ethnic, racial, gender groups following the Black Power model. I wanted this book to sort of be the example of how the Jews, navigated that.
Fascinating. So, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, you kind of stop really around the 70s, if I may. And again, if there's anything that you want to talk about with the book that I didn't mention or in your other works, please feel free to jump in. But I'm curious, was there a particular reason you wanted to stop around that period? Is there a reason you didn't go 80s, 90s, and beyond?
Right, thank you. So inevitably, when you write a book, you've got to sort of decide, right, when to start. Most start in 1954 because that's the Brown decision and the Montgomery bus boycott. I went to 1945 because I wanted to look at post-war America, and then I found out that, of course, there are antecedents before 1945. And then coming on the other side, I kind of just invented 1980 with the election of Reagan. Because my interest is in liberalism. So when the Carter administration ended and Reagan came in, I figured that's the new federalism is kind of a new moment. All that said, when you do a more contemporary history book, you always write an epilogue. And the epilogue is a non-academic sort of like, okay, I ended in 1980, you're reading it now in 2021, sort of what's happened between now and then. So I did put in sort of a postscript to it.
There's something you mentioned in your epilogue that I found very surprising in a good way, because you don't normally see this in this type of historical academic books, is you almost call yourself out in a way, because you write this book, it really in depth, very fascinating, and someone says to you, and I would love if you felt comfortable telling the story, but someone pretty much says to you, what about Jews of color? I would love if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to honor Ilana Kaufman, who is the one who was my teacher in this moment. And she's the founder and president now of the Jews of Color Initiative, which is a leading national organization to bring justice, within the Jewish community and without as well. So Ilana and I were having lunch, and I'd finished the book and sent it in. I knew it needed an epilogue, but I just needed a break from writing. So I sent it in the rest of the manuscript. And as we were chatting, it was actually the 50th anniversary of the Selma March. And the NAACP and Judaism's reform movement, of which I am a member because I'm about to criticize them, so I want to criticize them from the inside,
Fair enough.
we're having a march, right? They were recreating the march. They're going to go to DC. They're going to do a voting rights rally, all good stuff, right? And I was concerned, based, what we were talking about earlier, 200 Reform rabbis participated, which is fantastic. And I thought, oh no, are they going to come back to their congregations thinking they were Rabbi Heschel, that they were sort of, the savior of civil rights, or are they going to understand the depth of systemic racism and be humbled by the experience? So Ilana and I were chatting about this. And then Ilana, starts bringing up the Facebook photos. Because like all the rabbis put up a Facebook photo, and they're all the same, with all due respect. It's a white rabbi, the Torah, a black NAACP member, smiling, right? And Ilana's, where am I in this picture? Literally, where does a black Jew go in this picture? And in a deeper level, right, she, the phrase black Jewish relations is problematic. You can only relate between blacks and Jews if Jews aren't black. If you're both black and Jew, we have to begin with our vocabulary. So we're not assuming Jewish whiteness and erasing the experience of Jews of color, in this case, black Jews. And then Ilana turned to me and said, Mark, she said, you wrote 200 pages on blacks and Jews and not a single page on a black Jew. How could you do that? And I gave all my good academic defenses. I'm interested in how America relates to Jewish, how the 60s relates to Jewish, how Black Power relates to Jewish. That's my book. Yours is another, whatever. And she said, how about if you went and reread each of your chapters and asked yourself to the extent to which racial status, whiteness
Mhm.
is causal, if that's what actually explains what happened in that chapter and in that period,
Mhm.
um, what would you come up with? I was like, absolutely, that's right. You know, I missed racial privilege as causal, and guess what? You don't actually need Jews of color to talk about how Jews and whiteness matter. We need to talk about Jews of color because our best estimate now is Jews of color comprise 12 to 15% of American Jewish life. I've done a lot of learning since I had that lunch with Ilana, right?
Mhm.
And I said to Ilana, and I share this with her permission, right? I would like to make this lunch the epilogue.
Mhm.
I would like to unwind the conversation we just had to illustrate and basically to invite the next generation of scholar in the historiography to say, you got to look at Jews and civil rights and race through a lens of racial privilege.
So let me ask though, because you do the manuscript, you get to this part, you have this conversation where it's like, oh my gosh moment, about this book and not covering necessarily Jews of color. You could have gone back and put in Jewish color, a Jew of color at this time or this time. I'm curious if it was a decision where there just isn't as much scholarly research on necessarily Jews of color of these periods and therefore not able to talk about, or were you almost in a way emphasizing a message by not including it and making that part of the epilogue that, I'm doing what has been done and it's up to whoever the next person is to share this. So I'm curious what made you make that decision.
It's all deep and systemic, right? Which is to say, when I went into the archives, I didn't find Jews of color.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean that Jews of color didn't exist. It means they're not in the archives.
Hmm.
And if we want to talk about the way white privilege works and systemic racism operates, of course the stories would not be told. And if they're told, they're not going to be archived. By the way, this is an issue in women's history, starting in the 1970s, because most all the archival stuff was written by men, about men. So if you're an academic historian, and for me, a social historian, and you recognize that a whole part of the history is missing because it's not recorded in the archives. In earlier eras, if they weren't literate, they weren't in the archives. Now you have to be creative with your sources. And so first thing that's happening, I know American Jewish Historical Society and the archives in New York is working now on collections on Jews of color, right? Which is like, we need to actually go out and get the evidence that exists, and it needs to be in a place where future generations of scholars can more easily access it. And I just want to promote this book here because this is part of my learning. Charles McDew was the second president of SNCC, right? And a Black Jewish man, and he wrote a memoir, and through basically, it was one of my students said, "Oh my gosh, you should go read his memoir." So this is actually the first book on my list, and I'm thinking to myself, I kind of should have had that in the book, right? If the second president of SNCC was a Black Jew and I'm writing at it, that was a very obvious place to have it done. So I do that because it's important for me as a scholar to, always learning from the critique, but I also would like to model for everyone that all of us are works in progress and we're all learning. And we need to keep doing it, and I need to keep doing it too.
So I do want to ask you because this came out in, as I mentioned, 2018. You wrote a new preface, excuse me, excuse me, in 2020, and I was wondering if you would feel comfortable kind of talking about. It's not that unusual for books to have that sort of update on them. You've seen them, but usually, at least from what I've seen, it's usually quite a number of years. You felt to do it, with only 2 years. I'm curious, what made you want to do this, and if you can talk a little bit about what is the updated edition.
Yeah, thank you. So if folks are interested, this ultimately broke publicly. So if you go to the Forward's website, forward.com, and type in my name, there's a main article and lots of other ancillary articles and op-eds that followed. The book was published in 2018, and it sold out 3 print runs. And so first, yay me, I'm excited it sold out 3 print runs. But then I have to say it's an academic book and the print runs are pretty small. So it's not like it's a big bestseller, but academic books normally don't sell out. So yay me, that academic book sold out. And the editors at the press reached out to me and said, look, for the 4th printing, as you just intimated, typically we don't like add new stuff to a book for 10 or 20 years if it's still relevant. There's so much that's happened in just 2 years. And even in the last year, could you write a new preface that reflects on how the themes of your book have played out in the last 2 years? Sort of to bring it up to date, really up to date. I was just thrilled, right? And happy to do that. And just the idea that I would get a new preface and a fourth printing after just 2 years. So I wrote it up and sent it in. And the editors really liked it, which I was really happy about. And it was, it was set to go in. And then it was sent out for an anonymous peer review.
Okay.
Now, it is typical in scholarly and academic presses when you send in a manuscript to say, I want you to publish my book. They send it out to the experts in the field, and the experts respond anonymously because basically you want to be honest, and the people from the press want to be able to read it, and we're a small group anyway. You don't send a preface out. A preface is not academic. A preface is my own reflection on my own book on current events, right? That's what it is. And certainly you don't send it out for peer review if you're asking for the preface to begin with. Like, it's not like I said, please publish this. They said, would you write one? And the editors at the press actually liked it until they received what seemed to be a very harsh critique. And the harsh critique was about the words white supremacy.
Okay.
I said that there's a system of white supremacy in America where whites get to be supreme, right? Where if you're white, you get better healthcare, better education, policing, and all the rest of it. And Jews, at least since World War II, even as we've suffered anti-Semitism, and we have in the last few years have been the worst, we also have benefit from this culture of white supremacy. And they also didn't like that I used the word erasure. I described the historiography erasing Jews of color. And I said, of course, my own book included, because I referenced what you just said about the epilogue. So I was told that it was a problem that it had white supremacy, a problem that it said erasure, a problem that I was too apologetic. I actually think scholars should be apologetic if they don't get it right. And there was concerns that if somebody read the new preface, they wouldn't want to buy the book. Notwithstanding that you can't read the preface until you bought the book, but they were afraid it would actually diminish book sales. And they made the decision not to include the new preface. I'd like to say that I objected, except the book was sent to print before they even told me that they weren't going to publish it. So there was no time for me to navigate or to negotiate. So it brings up first a fundamental question about who controls the dissemination of knowledge. Academics are about academic freedom, and if anyone should be able to push the edge, right, in terms of even making people uncomfortable in our research, it's scholars. And I'm tenured, and I have, and I'm a middle-aged white man, right? So if anyone should be protected to be able to say something like that, ostensibly it should be me. So the fact that it was censored, and it was done by an individual or people who I still don't even know because they've done it anonymously. I said, you're using anonymity as cover for not wanting to talk about some political stuff that you don't want us to even debate. Whether you agree or disagree with what I say in the new preface, the point of an academic book is to have a debate or conversation about it. So eventually what happened was this story got leaked to the Forward, and the Forward called me and said, we think this is an important topic. And then from then it went public.
I mean, I took the time to read it. You can find on the website, which on your website, which of course at the end I'll ask for you to give the contact information for those who like to find out more about your work. But what was interesting is for me, strictly as an individual, I almost felt like it was just a summary of what you saw and experienced at the time, of Jewish agencies. Again, you don't really name them, which personally, as someone who is supported by a Jewish agency, I appreciate. But them doing self-reflection, some of them, recognizing their own privilege, trying to open the door. Like it really seemed like a reaction to what was not only obviously what happened to George Floyd, but also how the Jewish communities have reacted to it and what questions it brings up that have been the difficult ones, such as obviously the question of Jewish whiteness, which is something that's explored a little bit in the book and is mentioned and is a very big topic today in many Jewish communities. So I just thought it's a very interesting preface, and I'm sorry that it didn't go to print, of course. But if anyone wants to read it, and you'll mention the website for anyone who would like to. But to me, your book, I think it shows the history, but also not your message, because I don't think it's necessarily a political message, but shares the different lengths of looking at the story we tell ourselves and seeing that's much broader than we perceive it to be.
Thank you. And I want to add one other element that's important, because when this story broke and went public, my colleagues, scholars, reached out to me privately.
Hmm.
And women reached out to me to say, if a man, basically, right, can't get published an invited reflection of his own book after it was accepted because there's somebody or somebody's out there with enough silent power to stop it, how can I?
Hmm.
Junior colleagues, meaning untenured faculty, reached out to say, if you became the object of professional and in some cases personal rebuke in that forward article, that's a message to those of us without tenure that we should run away from being able to do what you are only able to do because I'm tenured and they can't fire me and I can find other presses for my work, right? Which junior scholars can't really afford to do. And scholars of color, Jewish scholars of color reached out to also say, if they're going after a middle-aged white man, full professor with tenure, one said to me, they're not ready for me, right? So there's a meta question, and for me, it's about the academy, right? And for me, it's Jewish studies professors, but I think that also sort of is emblematic of what's going on nationwide. So in one sense, it's a particular story about a new preface, but in a bigger way, I think it really is playing out a lot of the institutionalized racism that we see elsewhere.
Well, I was just going to briefly mention that even way prior to this, I know you have spoken out in regards to universities and the question of, whether, Zionist, anti-Zionist, as well as, freedom of speech and thought, and, not safe spaces per se, but, spaces of collaboration versus ones where, people may not feel safe to voice their opinions or views. So I just wanted to recognize that this has been something that you've talked about for a number of years in a number of capacities.
Yeah, and if I can, actually, that's my current book in progress,
Please.
which is sort of half memoir, half academic book. And that is that I'm now at San Francisco State University, which is one of the most leftist universities in the country. It has a strong anti-Zionist flavor to it.
Just
Yeah.
briefly, I had my master's at Columbia, so I sat.
Yeah, and occasional anti-Semitism. And my position in the Jewish Studies department is really to be on point in the fight against campus anti-Semitism. And folks go put my name at SF State down. You'll see a lot of that. I came to SF State from a college in LA and Los Angeles, which was in a right-wing political community.
Mhm.
And there I faced anti-Semitism from the other side of the political aisle. So the book is going to be, what is it like to be a Jewish studies professor and get anti-Semitism from both sides? Its working title is A Tale of Two Campuses, Jews, Identity Politics, and the Golden State.
Yes. Awesome.
So I'm working. I look forward to talking to you about that when I get that one done.
Look, if you wouldn't mind sending me an autographed copy, I'd appreciate. No, do you have any idea when it might be, or still in the drafting progress? Or
I'm still writing it. Yeah, I had the first half written, and then I sent it to the editors, so I'm going to go rewrite the first half. So.
Fantastic. So let me ask you, and I did talk about this a little bit, but for people who want to find what you're working on, what you're doing, what is the best way for people to see what you're doing, contact you, if they're interested in attending hopefully a future program where you're talking more about your book and your other work, where's the best places?
Thank you. I'll give you three answers. First, my website, which is my name, marcdollinger.com, and it's M-A-R-C. That would be important, no space in between. If you're interested if they're public talks, I put them on my Facebook page. So if you're on Facebook, you can always check there, or you can just send me an email, and you can send me an email from the website, and I'm happy to tell you. A lot of what I do are private. In other words, synagogues or JCCs have me, and they actually want to keep it small. Other times they're interested in bringing in as many as possible, so I can let you know.
So the last question I want to ask, because I know we focused a lot on one of your books, but again, your history and as well as your other books, which are also very fascinating and go into really the roots of American Jewish history and identity. Why do you think it's so important for Jews and non-Jews to know this history? Because I think there's the stories we tell ourselves, which is a big part of what we're talking about, but then there's the deeper events of what actually took place and the repercussions of them.
Yeah, thank you. I'll give you my snarky joke answer first, then I'll be serious.
Please.
The joke answer is I'm an academic historian, and it's tough enough to predict the past.
Fair
So
enough.
asked about the present or future, I'll leave to the social scientists. Now I'll give you, just as someone who is interested in this question. Um, there are multiple narratives about what it is to be an American Jew right now, right? And what I've heard from the Zoom audiences, especially since the murder of George Floyd, is a dissonance, a difference between what they thought happened and what they're hearing other people say it was like. And they're looking to bring the two together. So I think, a scholarly study of academic history allows us to let go of versions of our own past, which are preventing or inhibiting us from really making progress if we're going to future oriented now around race relations, going into the future. There's a lot of that old view I grew up with, which we just got to let go of if we are actually going to be side by side in a new version of the civil rights movement. So I'm hopeful that this kind of critique, even though it's uncomfortable to hear, can ultimately be redemptive.
I can't possibly thank you enough for taking the time to speak with us today, not only about your important work, but obviously about the other important pressing issues that we wanted to discuss. So I want to thank you so much, Professor Dollinger, for speaking with us today. For you who's watching, thank you so much for watching. I hope you stay safe and stay healthy. Professor, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
A pleasure. Take care, everyone.